would say best government, some government. And maybe what we've been trying to do over these last couple of decades is have too little government in some areas. Am I there? Yeah. So what I thought I would spend about 10 to 15 minutes talking with you about is what's happening with U.S. local government experience with privatization and what I think that suggests as challenges for future governmental reform. So I've put together a couple of slides because I think I don't know any Hebrew, I'm sorry. And if you have trouble following my English, maybe reading will help to supplement how I speak. But we all know that for the last several decades, there's been a worldwide experiment to substitute market delivery for government delivery, particularly in local government services like water, garbage collection, road maintenance, etc. And the experience, now that we have about 30 to 40 years of experience with privatization, we actually have strong empirical results and we can assess the effectiveness of this reform. And what we have found is that contrary to popular belief, privatization has not resulted in cost savings, which is a surprise because we all expected that it would. But when you look at the econometric studies over the last 3 decades, you discover that the studies that found cost savings were the ones conducted early in the period, back in the 1960s and the 1970s. You are much less likely to find empirical analyses that find cost savings in the more recent decades. There are several reasons for this. The first is that local government, under the pressure of privatization threats, has actually improved its internal processes and its own efficiency. The second is that there's not much competition in most local government service markets. And when there's no competition, what you've done with privatization is substitute a public monopoly, public delivery, for a private monopoly. And we all know from our economics theory that monopolies extract monopoly rents. And the question is, will these be public rents or private rents? And so what we find in our statistical meta-regressions looking at all the econometric studies that have ever been published, and we focused on water and waste as the 2 most common services to be privatized over these last few decades, we find that competition is the big problem, and policy environment matters critically in determining some level of competition. And so this issue of cost savings is one that we should be very careful about. There are cases where privatization is cheaper, but there are also cases where it is more expensive. And in most of the cases, there's no difference between public and private. The ownership is not the issue. The issue is management and how do we manage. The other thing that we found, if you look at privatization across place, we found in the United States that poorer communities are less attractive for privatization. So privatization is favored by richer communities. And so this notion of equality in privatization, it raises questions of privatization actually leading to increased inequality. And then the third thing that privatization was supposed to offer us was increased citizen voice, and Aaron just said it well. There's a difference between a citizen and a consumer. Increased consumer voice is one thing. Increased citizen voice is something else. And early privatizers, early local governments that privatized, thought they could go to the market and the citizen would get more choice. But the citizen actually didn't get more choice because we got a private monopoly instead of a public one. And so the more recent privatization practice shows that local governments are also building into their privatization process a citizen participation process, citizen committees to review the contracts, because they're recognizing that the market alone does not give adequate opportunities for voice. You need other kinds of forums other than the marketplace for people to have voice. So it should be no surprise to you that we've seen a lot of reversals in the last decade. England ceased compulsory competitive tendering. Australia ceased its requirements to force privatization. New Zealand elected Helen Clark back in the late 90s, and she lasted for a decade, and she rebuilt the capacity of government. Now they've gone back toward market again with their current prime minister. In the United States, privatization peaked in 1997, and we've had significant reversals since that time. But these reversals are not a return to the old bureaucratic delivery of the past. Instead, we're seeing some kind of a shift toward a new mixed position that tries to keep the benefits of market, but also bring back in the benefits of public delivery. And it's some kind of a balance between markets and public. And that's what we're seeing in the current data. So if you think about this theoretically, in the 1980s and 90s, the new public management was the reigning ideology, and it emphasized competition and efficiency. In the 1990s and 2000s, we realized that contract management is very difficult and very expensive. Monitoring is also very expensive, and so we began to give more attention to the transaction cost of actually making a contract and realizing that those are far from zero. They're actually quite expensive for local governments. In the new century, the 2000s, a lot of scholars have started to talk once again about the importance of citizen engagement in service delivery. And there's some people coined this the new public service, back to the notion of public service, serving a citizen rather than steering a market. And then with 2008, we have a financial crisis, and we recognize the role of the state in propping up markets. And so I think these new reforms are about searching for some kind of a balance. So our early privatization efforts were motivated by concerns with government failure. Governments oversupply public goods. We're all budget maximizing bureaucrats. We're inflexible. We're unresponsive. We don't give citizens choice. This was the complaint. But the current financial crisis raises attention to market failure. We obviously have, and markets do an inadequate assessment of risk. They don't give sufficient attention to fail-safe delivery to ensure that the service will be delivered regardless of what happens. There's issues with collusion and corruption, and there's clearly a need for regulation. So these decades of gutting the state and reducing regulations and giving markets free rein are now called into question because of the tremendous financial disaster that the world faced. So let's think for a minute, inside public contracting, what are the market failures we see there? Well, I've already mentioned that competition is hard to ensure because many local government public services are natural monopolies. Water is a good example. Even if you have competition when you first bid the contract, that does not mean you'll have any competition the second time you go out to bid the contract. Competition erodes, and most of the competition is for the market, for the original contract, and after that, there's no more competition left in the market for the second contract or the third. Incumbents win contracts at about 90%. This need for fail-safe delivery. This is a real problem because if you contract out your water system and the private firm fails in delivering quality water, the risk is always back on the public sector because the citizen expects the public sector to ensure high-quality water delivery. So when Toronto a few years ago had problems with E. coli in their water system, people complained to the city, not to the contractor. The city bears all the risk. And the city must maintain the internal intelligence and some level of control in order to ensure fail-safe delivery. As I mentioned before, contracting is not cheap. The challenges of contract specification and monitoring are significant. Some people suggest they might be 25% of the cost of the contract. Though I'll tell you, in New Zealand, local government officials became excellent and efficient contractors. But they showed me a contract for parks and recreation services in a little small community, and it was this thick. They had specified everything from how the ice cream vending will be done, to who mows the lawn, to the hours of the pool operation. You can see how tedious and detailed that would all be. But it's also boring. Who wants a job where that's all they do all day long is write a 300-page contract for every service? And so what's easier to do is to make a partnership. You're my good buddy. You're going to do my parks and recreation. We'll talk about what needs to be changed over the time, and it will be a relational contract that's flexible, that's based on trust, and we can change it over time. Agreed. But then we get to be good friends, and you up your prices, and I sort of let it slide. And before long, we've got a collusion problem going on here. And this may also explain why we see the cost savings only in the early period, and then they disappear over time. So relational contracting has its benefits, clearly, but it also has its downside. Democracy is not the same as markets. We thought that was the case. All that celebration in 1989 when the Iron Curtain fell, and we had this notion that we could equate markets and democracy in Eastern Europe. Well, we've discovered that democracy is something more than that, and issues of accountability, issues of public participation are really important. So how do you promote competition? Can you do it through regulation? Or does government need to be a player in the market? Who's going to ensure fail-safe delivery in a contracting network or a relational contract? If government is the insurer of last resort, can it afford the risk of contracting? For some services, yes. For other services, maybe not. I don't think it's just a matter of simple contract specification and monitoring. I'm going to show you one quick picture of what's happening with contracting in the United States. The green line at the top is public service delivery that's still done by government. You'll notice that's the majority. The blue line in the middle is the level of for-profit privatization. You'll notice that that's pretty flat over the last 20 years. The yellow line is intermunicipal cooperation, where governments work together to achieve economies of scale and efficiency. And you'll notice that even though that was dropping from 1992 to 2002, it is finally rising again. And these are the two primary alternatives to direct public delivery. You can go to the private market, or you can go to the public market of other cooperating governments. And that seems to be what's growing at the moment. And so the questions that raises are, if these new collaborative networks are on the rise, how do we ensure accountability when we have intergovernmental cooperation? Because there's, again, a separation from the direct connection of elected official to citizen. Public-private partnerships are becoming popular all over the world, but whose interests rule? And again, where does accountability come from? So as we move to the future, I think we're going to focus less on competition and the benefits of competition, because we've realized they're not so great. And we're going to focus more on the benefits of collaboration. But we're going to have to begin to figure out how we maintain a central coordinating role in a collaborative network, and how we ensure accountability and avoid collusion. And I think those are going to be the challenges for the future reform. Thank you.